Good Intentions Podcast. It looks like we are live. I am Dave Rail. I am here with James Damore. James, welcome. We've got a lot to talk about.
Thanks.
All right, good deal. So, James, I think there's a lot of things I want to talk to you about. I think most of the folks out there have heard the story, right, about what's happened with you and your employment with Google. I think what I'd like to do to start this conversation is I'll tell the story from my perspective as I see it, hopefully in a way that you can get behind and agree with, hopefully in a way that your critics can agree with as far as the narrative of the story goes. And then I'll let you tell me where I'm wrong or what you see differently as far as the story goes.
Yeah, sure.
Sound good? Okay. So you were working at Google, a job that you cherished and enjoyed and really considered it to be, if not a dream job, something close to it, right? You attended some diversity training sessions and feedback was sought in these diversity training sessions. You gave some feedback that ultimately turned into a document that was 10 pages outlining what you thought and why. And among the opinions in this document are some things that wound up being very controversial. I think you probably had an idea that they were going to be controversial. Your expectation was that this was a Google document that was internal to Google and that you were offering feedback for programs rather than creating a worldwide sensation of a philosophical kind of an argument. And then it was released outside of Google. It was leaked, I guess. And then a lot of things ensued that wound up branding you a misogynist and that you have some very negative opinions about women and think that they are biologically inferior and unable to write software as effectively as men. And I think we will get into some content and determine, well, not determine, I think we'll talk about whether you actually hold those opinions or whether those are misunderstandings. And so then you were ultimately fired from Google. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anything that you think should be added to the story that I'm missing?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well.
Okay. So I'm sorry, go ahead. You had something to say there?
No, go ahead.
Okay. When I came across I don't know whether it was a tweet or where I saw it, but I saw that there was this article on a site called Gizmodo that I'm not really familiar with, right? And it was, the title of the document was an anti-diversity screed, right? And I have some biases, right? As you spelled out in the document, we all have biases, and you were basically pointing out that not only do people who think that women are less capable of writing software than men are, not only do they have some biases, but everybody has some, right? There are a lot of things that we're not conscious of, and so I have some biases toward when I see these sensationalized headlines about anti-diversity. I typically think, oh boy, here we go again, right? The witch hunt has begun. And so I clicked on the link and I'm reading through this document and I'm thinking the whole time, right? I'm looking for the evidence that it is this anti-diversity screed. And I had to go look up the word screed because I didn't even know what that meant, right? So I was looking for the hysterical emotion in what you were saying about how women are so bad. And I didn't find it. Now, I have a bias that was expecting not to find that, right? And I think that was something you highlighted in the document, unconscious bias, right? Tell me about unconscious bias. What is this thing, and what's your position on it? Did I lose you? That is unfortunate. Hopefully. Well, I think we may have a connectivity issue. It looks like James,
Hey,
you're back. I don't know.
Computer just died for a second.
Say that again.
My computer just died for a second. I don't know why.
Oh man, that's a bummer. So I don't know how much you heard of my screed there, I guess. Unconscious bias. Tell me about that. What did you mean by that in your document?
Yeah, so Google talks a lot about unconscious bias and just how, because they need to find some reason why we have such a low representation of women, even though no one would ever say that they're consciously biased against women. And we never really see any instances of, oh, you're a woman, therefore you can't code. And no one is ever explicit about it. And so they, of course, they assume that everyone's the same, therefore any disparities that we see in the population must be due to some kind of bias. And so it must be some low-level unconscious bias that we're seeing. And this often comes in the form of what they say, like microaggressions. And we were also doing the implicit association tests until recently.
Okay.
They've recently disavowed that and said, yeah, the research really doesn't support that. So at least they are at least mindful of some of the disconfirmation of some of their research.
So it sounds like you acknowledge that unconscious bias exists and that you have things toward which you are biased and you probably don't know what they are, and hence the term unconscious, right? And so I think that kind of leads into, right? I mean, you could be this misogynist that they claim you are and not know it, right? Do you think there might be something to that?
They would claim that everyone is a misogynist, essentially.
Mm.
And even women, which...
Well, there may be something to that. I mean, we do make snap judgments about people based on, right? I mean, our human minds are pattern recognition engines, right? And you've had a bad experience with someone and you see some common traits in someone else. It's human nature that we are going to jump to conclusions about people. I guess I would say that in addition to having some internal misogynist to us, we're probably also internally misandrist at the same time. Would you say that that's probably true?
Yeah. Yeah, so, and I think we're actually very blind to the ways in which we're misandrous, so the ways in which we are biased against men.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, yes, there are unconscious biases, and I think it's a really interesting thing. So I've seen a term kind of thrown around regarding you, right? And I think you may have exaggerated the position a bit there, right? You said that that Google and other kinds of diversity kinds of programs and things say that they are insisting that everything is related to oppression and to environment rather than nature. And I think that that's probably going too far. And there may be some people who do actually say that everything is environment rather than nature, but at the same time, I think that statement is, most of us are probably somewhere in the middle, right? Thinking that there's contributing factors from both nature and environment that lead to who we are. And so differences between men and women in the employment in software development, it probably has some contributing factors from both nature and nurture, I guess. So, and I think the term that I've seen thrown around for you is that you are a biological essentialist because of what you wrote in your document, saying that your position is to the absolute extreme, right? That everything is biology, and I think I just heard you say that kind of the people that are criticizing you are the extreme opposite of that. I want to make sure that I think that there may be some elements of people who are biological essentialists. I don't think you are one, but well, tell me, are you a biological essentialist?
No, I definitely believe that there's a mix of nature and nurture, and they combine in interesting ways that we don't fully understand. Yeah. But I would say, though, that there are people in these diversity programs, and maybe they're a minority, but they're a very vocal minority that believe that it is all just societal pressure and societally constructed differences between the genders. Yeah. And that was what caused a lot of the outrage.
I think that makes sense. And I guess if you are of that position, that it is one extreme or the other, if somebody says, well, hey, there's a contributing factor from this other thing, it's probably natural to think that they are extreme about it as you are. And, and therefore kind of the far camps, right? Rather than having some middle ground.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So would you say that you are more of a middle grounder?
Yeah, I'm definitely more of a middle grounder, and the document was really just trying to show the other perspective that's being silenced at Google, because we never discuss any of the actual psychological differences between men and women, for example, and how we can leverage those to increase diversity.
Okay. So the psychological differences, right? You make the contention that, well, and let me say too, right? In fairness to you, I think the document that I read was, to me, it had the proper humility in the face of these things, right? You talked about this may be a contributing factor. This may be some of these things, right? It's not these absolute statements of, I know beyond reproach that this is the thing that does this, right? And so I think that that's important to acknowledge, that I think that scientific humility and, there may be some hubris that you have somewhere in you, but I didn't see it in the document.
Yeah, I'm definitely cautious because I know that there are, gender roles in the society, and there is pressure to fit in that gender role. And so that might contribute to some of this, although, there is conflicting evidence with that theory, because a lot of these personality differences are actually exaggerated in the societies that have the weakest gender roles, like the Nordic countries. And these personality differences are smallest in some of the most oppressive civilizations.
I've heard that argument. Dr. Jordan Peterson, I think, is where I heard that. Interesting. As I was reading your document, I was hearing Dr. Peterson's voice. I think you've been influenced by him, right? So I've heard him make that argument. I don't know about the citations on that or where it comes from, but yeah, the assertion is that societies that are free to allow people to choose roles that are not necessarily the ones that are traditionally of their gender, that people choose those roles even more so than in societies where there's this kind of more drive toward those things, which is kind of a counterintuitive result. But do you know more about the citation on just that really is the case?
Yeah, so there's been studies with 1 million people across 55 different countries, and including countries all over the map, and you see this clear trend of more gender egalitarian, larger gender differences, and you even see this within a country. So just to take occupation as an example, if you just look at the lower socioeconomic status populations within the United States, there really isn't much of a gender gap in STEM. But once you go to high socioeconomic status, where people have more freedom to choose what they actually are passionate about, the men in STEM stay the same, but then women in STEM drop, and they go more into the social jobs.
It's an interesting statistic there, and I think there are probably a lot of ways that could be interpreted, and among them that there are biological differences, right? So I think these psychological differences that you cite, right, and that I've seen Dr. Peterson cite as well, to say that they are biological, and I don't think you did. I think there's probably both some environment and when saying that women in STEM are, that there are contributing factors to whether they go into STEM that are both environmental and biological. I think to say that these observed psychological differences, they also probably have contributing factors that are biological and environmental. Do you dispute that?
No, yeah, there's definitely contributing factors from both sides.
Yeah, yeah, and among those things, right? I mean, I've heard about some women having experiences with Barbie dolls, right? Teen Talk Barbie, I think, was the name of it, and one of the things that Teen Talk Barbie would say is, "Math is hard. Let's go shopping," right? And some of those things that probably did contribute to some of these gender stereotypes, right? So I think to discount that there are, that there are nurture things, I think would be a mistake. But I don't think you are doing that.
Right, and if you just want to look at the stereotypes in particular, females growing up and males growing up, they both don't really have a stereotype that women are worse at coding or worse at computers. And so I don't think that stereotype is really pervasive in our culture.
Yeah, yeah. So there were some terms that you used in the paper that kind of, I think, contributed to the trouble, right? One of them being neuroticism, and I've heard you talking on the Rubin report and the Joe Rogan experience about that term was charged and a problem with it. And I want to ask you about that and get into that term. But I think even more than that, and I don't think I've heard you address this, right? I've seen some Twitter discussions of this whole debacle, this whole thing, right? And people saying that, well, you're really talking about preferences and that women generally don't choose things like software engineering, which, that may be due to their preferences. Maybe there. Well, there are certainly other factors. So preferences seemed to be, in my opinion, the thing that you were emphasizing in the document. But in some of these Twitter discussions, when people were saying, "Well, it's about preferences," the term abilities kept coming back, right? You talked about preferences and abilities. Do you think, so abilities, right? You don't see any women in the National Football League. And I think that there's, few would argue that that's purely a matter of oppression. I suppose there might be some women who want to play in the NFL and are capable, but are deterred, because of prejudice. But I imagine that would be a very rare case, right? There are different abilities there. Now, to extrapolate that to software development is a stretch at best, right? So, but abilities, right? Tell me about that. What was that? Was that term a mistake?
No, so it actually came from an earlier version of the document, which contained some stuff that we know about math and verbal ability. So, there's not really an average difference in math ability, but there is a difference in verbal ability between men and women. And so, especially as you look at the high achieving individuals, so women are much more likely to be balanced and so both good at math and verbal, but then men are much more likely to be only good at math and bad at verbal. And so these men don't really have an option besides tech and STEM type positions.
Something technical.
Yeah, while the women have much more options and can go into law, for example.
That's interesting. It stands to reason, I guess, that there are differences in abilities, and whether those are relevant to software, I don't know. I don't want to think it is, right? I don't want to think that there are innate differences that make one gender better at software than another, or even worse, right? Worse at software than another. Do you think that women are genetically less suitable to writing code?
No, definitely not. I mean, I think it's really just not as many women are interested in it. And if you talk to the average person in Silicon Valley, they're just obsessed with coding, and many of them do it on the weekend, and they really are just interested in coding itself and playing with the system, which just many people in the population in general aren't that obsessed with coding, right?
Yeah. I mean, it is a unique trait to really get into this thing of turning a text file into working software. And I didn't mention, and I think some people may know who I am, but I'm a software developer myself. So we're speaking here coder to coder, right? So tell me about that. I mean, you didn't have a computer science background, is my understanding, and you wound up kind of you were doing some coding related to your science expertise and your schooling, and got noticed by Google. I think that's what you told Dave Rubin. Tell about that story.
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't actually related to my education at all. It was just, I found some books in the library about algorithmic puzzles, and I've always really liked puzzles and trying to understand stuff. So, once I got more into these puzzles, I started doing these coding competitions. For example, the Google Code Jam. And at some point I did well enough that they just contacted me directly, and I did an internship with them.
So this was just kind of code for competitively, I guess, in some sense, right? It's creating a working algorithm in the parameters of this thing. And so that was kind of just, you hadn't really done software before that. You were just reading some algorithms books and just kind of digging into it.
Yeah, I mean, I knew some coding, but mostly just through books.
So how long ago was this?
That was 2012, I think, when I did the Google Code Jam.
Okay, that's a fairly significant amount of time. And when did you go to work for Google?
2013. So the summer after that, I interned.
Okay, so you've had a few years in software development. So I'm curious about this because this is not my only podcast, right? I've also got a podcast where I talk to software developers and get them to tell stories and find out about things in their career. And one of the things that has come up many times is that software, and something that I know now, but probably for about the first decade of my career doing software development, I didn't realize this. But many of the great minds in software development that I've talked to have expressed the same opinion, that writing software is more about people than it is about code. right? And so I think that somebody young in their career, you probably have some inkling of that, having experienced what you have in software development. I noticed that in your suggestions for ways to improve diversity in the document that you suggested, right, emphasize some of these very human aspects of the craft that are there, right? And I think a lot of those things are getting more and more emphasis, not necessarily as a catalyst for diversity, but because they work and they're good, right? You mentioned pair programming and some of these things that are very high touch, and getting involved in the domain of the software that you're trying to do instead of just being a software specialist. These things are all very important. And so I think it resonated with me that your suggestions really embody the true nature of the craft of software development, and the perception of geeks in basements is probably more a barrier than we might realize, right? Because that's not really the way that it works in the software world.
Yeah, I think there's a mix. Some people do work best just coding by themselves at night on a Red Bull or something. But we should allow people to write code in many different ways, and pair programming does seem to help some people. I personally don't like it, just for myself, but I just like doing it myself, and I don't like necessarily depending on someone else. But I think it's a lot of this, like, diversity and inclusion is just letting people be themselves and do it how they want it to. And so expanding the options will naturally help that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned in this, or you were explicit in this supposedly anti-diversity document, right, about the fact that you do value diversity, right? And I mean, that could be taken as one of those, right? Somebody says, I'm not racist, but, and then proceed to say something very nasty about, somebody of some race. So, I mean, I understand that, that explicitly stating that you are pro-diversity doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an anti-diversity document. But you did state that you value diversity. Why? Why do you value diversity?
I'm personally just very xenophilic. So, I like new and different things. And I like understanding the world. And I think it's hard to understand the world if you only talk to yourself, basically. And, if everyone is just like you, then you're basically just talking to yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why, and I think that's typically when talking about diversity, and I have talked about diversity in tech quite a bit on my other podcast, one of the big selling points, and rightly so, is what you were talking about, right? Getting different perspectives, people with different ideas give you a better whole product that serves your general populations. And I think if that's the case, then your argument for why diversity of thought is important, in addition to diversity of things that are more superficial, right? I think that these things like race and gender and all of these things do lead to having different experiences of the world and the way it works. Right. And so they do lead to differences of thought. But you argue that differences of thought are potentially even more important than some of the more superficial things. And I'd argue that the reason that the superficial things are important is because they lead to diversity of thought. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I definitely think that we should be valuing diversity of thought and empowering people to say what they think without being harshly judged for that. And that's why I talk about psychological safety. And even Google has seen that diversity itself doesn't actually help. It's when you have diversity plus psychological safety, that's what you need.
And psychological safety. My understanding is that you are free to express what you know about your opinions, whether it's about the system that you are building or something different, right? But potentially relevant, especially to team dynamics, right? Unpack that term for me. Tell me more about what it means.
Yeah, it's often, how can teams work best together? And, one clear example would be, for example, in the medical field, if the attending doctor, so someone that's superior to you, makes some suggestion, and then you don't feel comfortable saying, oh no, I think that actually the diagnosis is something different, then, and if you're right, then the patient may die. And so being able to voice your opinion and feel like even if you're wrong, you won't be harshly judged. That's really important to having effective outcomes for teams.
It's got to be okay to be wrong, because you can't really be right without first being wrong, right? I mean, we stumble along the way. Learning to walk is an exercise in falling down and doing it wrong until you can finally get it right. So I think that is important. What do you say to somebody who says, James is a raging misogynist, and therefore, as a woman, right, I don't feel psychologically safe on this team because I'm going to be judged by him simply because I'm a woman?
I would counter that by, I discussed many of these ideas with the women on my team already, and they largely actually agreed with it, that they see the differences and they think that, yes, these are good suggestions for making me feel better in this workplace. And so they weren't offended by it. And I don't think that anyone in particular would necessarily be offended by it.
I think it's mostly that biological essentialism claim, right? That I think if you follow that to its logical conclusion, then you do think that women are innately less capable of doing the job, and therefore some of these claims about you being hostile and creating a hostile work environment, there's an argument to be made there, right? I mean, do you agree with that?
I think even if you were to take it to the extreme, you still have to acknowledge that there's a distribution of these preferences. And so not all men or women are the same within their gender. So you still can't even say anything in particular about any individual female about this. So I think even if you go the extreme route, it's still not offensive to the individual.
Yeah, yeah. So there was, I kind of see this as kind of the face of the opposition to you. There was a prominent DevOps expert, right, at an Agile conference that that devoted a portion of his keynote talk to denouncing your position and to basically trying to, I mean, my understanding of his perspective would be that he's standing up for women in tech, right? And I think he made some arguments that were pretty compelling in this talk. He also said some very nasty and just vicious things about you, which I think is unfortunate, and I think that really sets the conversation back. And I do not condone that, right? And I think when I see my children behaving that way, it's something that I try to nip in the bud right away, right? You're calling somebody dumb because of things. It's not behavior that I think is something that brings us forward. But I think he did bring the thing forward too, right? By taking the attitude that women matter, and I think they do. And he one of the things that I thought was really compelling that he talked about was he cited this study, this paper by somebody. There were several authors on the paper. The kind of the face of it seems to be this Sarah Jane Leslie, who I don't remember the school, Princeton, I believe it was. And the correlation that they found, right, it was that among PhD students, that there was a correlation in fields that women get, or the fields that have low percentage of PhD candidates or recipients, that those fields also tended to have a perception of that this field is that innate talent drives the success in this field. And he kind of put that out as the refutation of biological essentialism, which I think it does a good job of refuting that. I think it resonates with me, the idea that it is harmful in our fields to have what Carol Dweck calls a fixed mindset, right, versus a growth mindset. I imagine you read a lot, right? You've probably read Dr. Dweck. Can you just respond to that and just tell me what you think of the relevance of that argument?
Yeah, so I think that there are different ways that men and women approach things. And so, and we even see this within computer science interviews. So there's one study that looked at, why are we seeing fewer women go through interviews? And it tried to see if there's any bias within the interview. So they actually did voice modulation to see, if it's male or female, then is there any bias? And so they didn't see any bias there. But they did see that after failing a couple times, women just dropped out of it, and while the men continued forward. And so there may be some aspect of men just seeing or just pushing farther on some of these things. And so if there's a field that maybe the popular conception is, oh, you have to be naturally good to succeed in this, which is definitely a sort of a bad thing to tell people, because you want to say that, you know, hard work can help you succeed in this. And, you know, I see a lot where we put women as a victim and where they don't have personal agency. And this is seen a lot in feminist literature too, where there's a gendered nature of agency, where men have agency, women don't. And so if there's any fault that happens, if it happens to a guy, then it's the guy's fault. If it happens to a girl, then it's society's fault. And so that sort of pushes men to sometimes try harder and not ask for help. You know, there's a large difference in how much men and women ask for help in school and in a lot of life situations, which also causes men to, unfortunately, die from suicide more often.
There's a lot there, anecdotally, right? I think about my own children, and I just, as you were describing that asking tendency, right? I think about just playing with my kids, right? My son is, I mean, he's instantly in my face the moment he gets out of bed. Play, 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 right? He wants me to participate with him. My daughter at one point expressed that she felt a little less valued because I played with my son so much. And I was like, you know, I was surprised by it. Maybe I should have seen some signs of it, but you know, it came down to that fact that you know, he asks, and I think there's something to be said for that. You know, I've spent a majority of my life not asking for what I wanted, right? Being very passive and expecting that success was going to come to me. And I think you expressed something like that to Dave Rubin, right? That you had some of these tendencies that are often attributed to some of these female kinds of things, right? Again, about that distribution, right? There are many males who are like us. Really, it's opened up a lot for me to ask people for what I want, and I think that. So correlating that with male and female, it strikes me that that there is plausibility to that argument, that's relevant to all of these things, right? Success, leadership, tech, all of this kinds of stuff, and this correlation might be explained by that. So I think that's interesting.
I think also this correlation is really often just, you know, the more quantitative a field is, the more people feel like it's innate quality, right? And then the more qualitative it is, the less innate talent you need for it. And
it fits intuition, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, women are better at verbal in general, and so they can succeed in these more qualitative fields, while men aren't. And so the only place where they can compete often is these quantitative fields.
Yeah. Again, on average, right? It's a distribution.
Yeah, right.
So yeah. So I think that clarifies some things. You know, I think about this too, that, you know, women on average are better in verbal and some of those kinds of things. Some of the misunderstanding of the true nature of what software development is. It's also possible that, hey, maybe women are, yeah, actually, this was asserted by one of my guests on my podcast, that when he hires women, that they perform better, and that you know, anecdotally, of course, right, in his experience, women made for better hires, right? It's possible that women are genetically superior to men as far as developing software as well, right?
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
And
Which,
I
of
mean,
course,
obviously, you know, if there is pressure against women to join these fields, then only the ones that are very good would end up succeeding. And if there were bias against them, then you would see them performing better in hiring, like, or after they're hired. So, you know, Paul Graham has this nice essay on how you can detect bias. And it's really just look at how well those different populations perform after you hire them. If one population performs better, then you're sort of biased against them when you're hiring, right?
that makes sense. Yeah. But I mean, there are so many confounding factors that it's really
Yeah.
hard to make any conclusions about anything. So why does all this matter, right? I mean, you could have just gone on doing your job, not bothered to do any feedback in this, right? I mean, you value diversity. It seems like you think that there may be some reasons why these programs are not necessarily effective, and I don't know if that's true, right? I don't know about the efficacy of diversity programs. Maybe that's a good place to start. Do you know some figures on are they actually increasing diversity?
The percent of women in tech in Google is slowly increasing, on the order of 1% per year. So they could say that it's maybe increasing things, but they really don't have a good way of measuring the actual efficacy of these programs. And part of the reason I wrote this was because I saw that there were actual, real disadvantages to these programs, and those disadvantages weren't really being acknowledged at all.
And you were speaking as a Google employee with the interests of making Google the best it could be and saying, hey, there are costs associated with this approach. What are we getting for this investment, right? Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So, and 1% growth, I mean, that sounds, well, I don't know that I don't know whether that's slow or reasonable. I don't know. I mean, the culture is changing, right? I think there is much more awareness of, hey, women can do this, and much more message that that is the case. And I've heard of biases in mathematics as far as teachers favoring boys raising their hands and all of those kinds of things. And I think that people are conscious of that, and I imagine teachers are probably making efforts to resolve some of those things. I mean, it's impossible to tell whether these. Well, you said that, right? I mean, whether these programs are paying off in this increase or whether it's really just cultural, probably some combination of both, maybe.
Yeah, and we can't measure the disadvantages really, and so I mean we can go into some of the disadvantages too if you like.
Yeah, go ahead with that, please.
Yeah, so I mean, and to go back to why I actually went into this program was because I saw some actual inclusion problems in my team. And so, there were some people that just weren't, as involved in the team. They weren't going to team lunches. There are some people that, in some ways are not neurotypical. And also just generally some people would dominate the meetings while others wouldn't really speak up at all. And so I wanted to, figure out how we could increase, psychological safety on our team and just general inclusivity. And so I think a lot of these approaches actually decrease psychological safety. Making us way too sensitive can actually decrease our willingness to speak up because it causes us to constantly self-censor. And I also saw just a lot of alienation of social conservatives and even fiscal conservatives, but not to the same extent. And that itself is causing huge problems in our culture. And also these programs just generally, because they emphasize so much your group identity and identify you, like they even say, okay, when you say something, say it as a white male, I see this. And we should be, okay, we're Googlers first, we're coders second, and we're all here together. We don't need to emphasize what our group identity is to be able to work as an effective team. And I felt like that was actually creating group tensions, which we see on college campuses. The more you emphasize group identity, the more you increase tensions and emphasize sort of a zero-sum struggle between the two.
It sounds like you're saying that it's harmful to acknowledge your prejudices, something like that, right? That's probably a cartoon version of what you're saying there. But I think the intent of as a white male is to say that I have a perspective and I know that there are things that I haven't seen, and therefore, right, take this for what it's worth in that context. Well, is that itself harmful?
I think that itself may not be harmful, but it's often used to invalidate other people's perspective. And especially once we start ordering these different ethnicities and genders and saying, okay, if you're a white male, then you are the oppressor, and therefore your voice doesn't matter. That is really harmful.
I agree. I do agree with that. I've mentioned in places that I had a prominent guest, a software developer, on my show, and we talked about diversity in tech. And he basically said, "Oh, look, here we are, two white guys talking about diversity." And it struck me that that was very much a suppression of the value of somebody's opinion based on race and gender. And so I think you have a point there. And I think, intent is, this is the Good Intentions podcast, and I really think it is fundamentally important that we acknowledge that people have good intentions and that there's really not nefarious things going on here. But at the same time, right, that by their fruits you will know them, right, is to go biblical. That the outcome matters too, and good intentions is not enough. That kind of thing.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah. So how's your life now, man? You are unemployed. I imagine you've had a lot of very nasty things directed your way. Are you holding up okay?
Yeah, I get a lot of private support. Oh, sorry, there's someone at my door. Just a sec.
Okay. I guess we'll hold on for a moment here. I wanted to say, actually, I don't know what I want to say. Trying to fill space here. But you know what? I think James is a fundamentally good person who got caught up in something remarkable, right? So, all right. So private support, right? I think is where we left it.
Yeah. So there's many people that privately show their support, and so that really helps a lot. There are very few people that actually want to meet with me and actually disagree with me and think that I'm a horrible person, or no one actually wants to discuss these issues if they really oppose me. So I've had a lot of good and interesting discussions with people that maybe disagreed on some points, but at least they didn't think that I was some sort of bigot, and so that was nice. And most of the negative comments are just on these public forums where it's, they're not really looking for an actual discussion. They're just often virtue signaling.
Yeah, yeah. The negativity, right? It makes me think of a religious devotion, right? The keynote that I was talking about, right? Saying, that he kind of went into that, there's a little bit of you, right? He used you as the personification of misogyny, and it's man, that's a hurtful thing to say, and I think in the name of trying to avoid hurtfulness, to be hurtful is unfortunate, but it reminds me of a kind of a religious kind of a thing, right? That, I mean, I can remember a time that I was leaning left, and the reason was that the religious right was the attitude was, right, that we disagree on something, and therefore I'm right and you're wrong, and because of your wrongness, you are morally inferior, and because of your moral inferiority, I am justified in doing and saying some really nasty things toward you, and not only justified, but virtuous in doing so, right? And I think the cheers in that talk for saying nasty things about you is a manifestation of that, right? And so I think that was the religious right, and I think that we all have some of that religious fervor in us, right? And it's hard not to disagree with somebody and turn them into something evil. You said in the document, one of your suggestions is to demoralize diversity. And I think it's along the lines of that sentiment. Tell me what that means.
Yeah, so I was going to actually mention it because it's very similar to this, and because people are treating this like a new religion where it's held up as some high moral value, diversity, and anyone that opposes this idea or tries to discuss it in some dissenting way is evil and as a villain, and so people feel morally justified in suppressing their opinion and attacking them. So yeah, both sides. I mean, the religious right, I too was very much turned off by that. But this sort of regressive left that we're seeing is sort of a religion in itself too.
Yeah, I think that there's really not much difference between the two, other than the things that they denounce, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So demoralizing it. I think it sounds like demoralize, right? But it means something very different. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
diversity. You are pro diversity. Um, Alienating conservatives was the next thing that you had in your suggestion, right? Stop alienating conservatives. Tell me more about, I mean, these terms, conservative, liberal, have lost all of their meaning to me. How do you see alienation of conservatives manifest?
So there's a lot of cases where Google's social values get pushed onto the employees, and anyone with a different viewpoint is instantly seen as, you know, evil and the enemy of Google and Googlers in general. And you know, there's no respect for anyone that could have a differing opinion. You know, we saw this on the company-wide meeting right after Trump was elected. You know, the top executives were crying, and you know, they were saying, "Oh yes," you know, it made anyone that could have voted for Trump feel like they could never be open about that.
Yeah.
And uh, you know, there have been examples in the past where, you know, I'm all for gay rights and I actually enjoy gay pride parades, but you know, I could definitely see some people not enjoying a gay pride parade. You know, it's not for everyone. And so uh, someone said, "Oh yeah, I just don't want to go," and the team was going to the gay pride parade, and they were fired for that.
Fired? Really?
Yeah, that's
Wow.
really just too extreme.
That yeah, I mean, I've got to take that with a grain of salt, right? Not knowing the situation myself, not having experienced it. That may have been your bias speaking into that. That's why they were fired. But at the same time, that's pretty extreme, and to hear a story like that is alarming, to say the least.
Yeah, and there's just many examples of, if you ever say that you're conservative on any of these views, like, you know, someone said that they're pro-choice or pro-life, and so their team instantly ostracized them, and they felt like, oh no, I can never work with that person. When really they were the same person as the day before. They just have a different viewpoint on one topic that's completely unrelated to work.
So people of differing opinions, right? I mean, hostile work environment is the term that gets thrown around, right? And I guess, the assertion there is that you not wanting to attend the gay pride parade makes the work environment hostile to people who are sympathetic to homosexuals, or perhaps even homosexual team members, right? How can we reconcile this, right? That that your beliefs cause me to feel unsafe or unwelcome, that it's a hostile environment, versus the ostracism of the conservative opinion. I mean, it seems like we are kind of at an irreconcilable impasse if everybody is kind of in the situation where, I've got these things that make it very hard for me to come to work because of these things.
And so I also see this very similar to the whole microaggression. So they're conflating speech or opinions with violence in this. And yeah, it's really hard to disentangle them with this ideology so dominant. I think that, you know, at least making people truly understand each other and having a sense of mutual respect and acceptance for each other, that would go a long way. And so, you know, I often think of it sort of like those studies where they had, you know, a gay person talk to a family and say, "Hey, I'm homosexual, but you know, I'm a normal person." And you know, if they really get to know that person, then that family can change from being maybe even anti-gay to, you know, very accepting of homosexuals. And so maybe the answer is to just show people that someone can be socially conservative, but also a human being, and they can actually be, a productive Googler, then they shouldn't be just alienated for some of their viewpoints.
Yeah, I think we catch more flies with honey than vinegar anyway, is the old saying. And if you want to be a force for helping somebody to see the light on something, then by being a light for them is probably a better way than being a denouncing force. So
right.
I promised to ask you about neuroticism, and I forgot about it. Let's get back into terms, right? Neuroticism. What is that? Why was that included, and why was it a problem?
Mm-hmm. So that's one of the big 5 personality traits in psychology. So the 5 traits being openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so these personality traits are just very well studied, and there have been studies of over 1 million people with these metrics. And so I was just using the currently accepted term for it, but it has a long history. And so I was so into the psychological literature that I wasn't really cognizant of maybe some of the social connotations of it.
So you quoted literature or not necessarily quoted, but you used the terminology of the literature to describe this phenomenon of a psychological trait that has some variance among genders, I guess is one of the things. And so what does it really mean, right? I mean, I hear us say, oh, you are so neurotic all the time, right? But it seems like one of those terms that is just kind of more an insult about somebody's mental state rather than really something used with an actual clinical meaning.
Yeah, so the personality trait is mostly just related to how much anxiety you may feel or your stress tolerance. So it's also called now negative emotionality. So how susceptible you are to negative emotions, which isn't necessarily bad. It is good to feel negative emotions if something negative is happening. And the reason why we likely evolved these negative emotions is to call us to action. For example, when our child is crying, we need to actually comfort them, and we need some motivation to do that.
That makes sense. Yeah. So that brings up something else, right? Empathy. One of your suggestions was to de-emphasize empathy. And I think that's, I haven't necessarily heard that really emphasized in a lot of the analysis that I've heard and the reasons why this makes you a misogynist. But it strikes me as something that is hard for me to accept, right? I mean, it's been a theme on my podcast with developers that empathy is critical to being an effective software developer. And so I found that to be surprising. I think it may have to do with different types of empathy and different directions of the term. But why did you say de-emphasize empathy?
Yes. The bullet point was really just too terse, so you have to go to the paragraph below that. I was not saying that it's bad to understand people, or even that emotional empathy, so being able to feel other people's emotions, that is useful for one-on-one communication and working with a team. But empathy is actually really bad for judging policies, and particularly what I was trying to address was how we're judging different diversity practices. And just as you wouldn't want some foundation to decide which charity to give money to based on how sad the little girl on the picture of the charity looks, which is just fueled by empathy, you wouldn't want to be judging different diversity programs based on something as superficial as that.
It sounds like you are either quoting or influenced by Paul Bloom on that. Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a guest on my developer podcast who was talking about empathy and its importance, and I had some critical things to say about Paul Bloom. And I hadn't really heard anything about Paul Bloom, but I did later hear him on Sam Harris's podcast talking about that very thing, that that empathy has its valid uses, but that cooler heads prevailing is one of the things that it can, and in that form of emotional contagion, that it can get in the way of cooler heads prevailing. And I think there's an argument to be made for that.
Right, definitely.
Okay, that makes sense. So conscientiousness is one of those big five traits too, right?
Mhm.
What does that mean?
So it can be thought of as sort of both orderliness and also perseverance. And so conservatives often, you'll see them. So I guess this is related to me saying that conservatives on average are higher on conscientiousness. And so conservatives often are more orderly, and this is why they are often more closed in some ways, and maybe value clean environments. Uh, Conscientiousness can also be good for software development, and especially at a mature company like Google, where there's so many products and no one really wants to maintain them. Being the personality where you actually do want to maintain it and keep the system running, that's very valuable to
Yeah.
the
Oh,
company,
yeah.
and there's very few people who do that.
There is a preference in software for greenfield development. I want to work on the new and exciting thing versus maintaining the existing thing. And I've had some guests on my show who are some of those people who take great joy in legacy code and making things cleaner. And it's a personality type that, like you said, has a lot of value.
Mhm.
Yeah. So another term. Discrimination. Right. I think that's another thing that's gotten you in hot water is that you called Google's efforts at diversity discrimination, and I think a lot of people. I think it depends on how you define discrimination. Right. If you see that discrimination is always a negative thing, then there might be a reason to criticize you for that. But what did you mean by that?
Just treating people differently based solely on their race or gender.
Yeah. So you talk about a discriminating palate, right? It means that I'm preferring one type of food over another one, right? So at its core, discrimination is preferring one thing over another one. So I think by that definition, it would be hard to find fault in the idea that programs that are exclusively for somebody of a gender and racial makeup, right? That is a form of discrimination. Now, that going further, right? Does that mean that it's negative and therefore should not happen? I think is a completely different argument. Do you think that is that discrimination itself is an argument for why some of these things are maybe misguided?
So I think there are. It depends on how you value different things, and so there are arguments that this is unfair, and so that would be an argument against discrimination, even when it serves an underprivileged group. But of course, there are also advantages to helping a group that you see as underprivileged.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I can't really come to any conclusion myself about, do these things do a net good and that they are worth the costs that they have associated with them, or they don't. I know that there are a lot of people who might have had opportunities in software development that, and they would have had some wonderful contributions, right? I guess I can't say that I know that there are people who didn't make it into software because of discrimination, right? The type of kind of societal discrimination, right? The unconscious biases, all of those things that these programs are intended to remedy, right? There are probably a lot of people who have lost opportunities because of that, and we as humanity have probably lost the opportunity to have their contribution. So, I mean, does that de facto make it worth any cost to try to give some of those people opportunities?
Possibly, although I don't think that that's limited to just people of a certain race or gender. And I think really in our society today, the biggest factor is your family's socioeconomic status.
Mm,
So poor people across all groups really are struggling, and we should do more to empower those people rather than just assuming that because someone has a certain fits certain checkboxes that they necessarily faced certain discrimination, when the research that they're using to justify these programs is really, it hasn't really been replicated, and they're just cherry picking certain studies when there are studies that show the opposite, and the net effect of a lot of these things is zero. So it's, they're really just justifying or using whatever data that they want to justify ideological practices.
I think there's a cost too. One that I don't hear expressed a lot, but I have heard among some of my podcast guests and in some other places that there is a that being a woman in tech has negative consequences, right? Overtly negative consequences, sexist things, bad things that happen to you because of it. There are also some positive things that happen because of being a woman in tech, and that there's kind of this underlying question, in the minds of as I've heard it expressed by someone, that there's always this question of, did I get this opportunity because of my merit or because I'm a woman? And I think that's, I don't think I've ever experienced that myself, that I feel like I've gotten some opportunity because of a group. So I don't know what it's like to do that, but I imagine that to be, right, to use cognitive empathy as opposed to affective empathy. I imagine that to be a pretty hard thing to go through, right? And so I don't know, have you heard people address that kind of a cost as well?
Yeah, there's definitely many people that wish that people didn't view them as a diversity candidate, and that I see as one of the costs to a lot of these programs is creating tension between groups and actually making people feel like maybe they don't belong.
Yeah. I've heard Thaddeus Russell, right? Do you listen to his podcast? Are you familiar with him?
I'm familiar with him, but I haven't listened to his podcast.
His podcast is exquisite. It's one of my favorite things that I've come across. He has expressed this idea, and I think that he got some of this from Glenn Lowry, who he had on the show, that diversity, getting students into highbrow colleges that are of racial minority backgrounds is often pitched as being a benefit for the white students at the college, right? That it enhances their experience, and I think rightly so that it does. But that leaves a lot of these diversity entrants into the school in a position where they're kind of there as an enhancement rather than really with the pure intent of giving them an awesome educational experience. And I don't know, I mean, intents, right? How do you know what somebody's intent really is? But he's kind of expressed that this is, this Glenn Lowry, a black man, right? He's saying that we want to be treated like men rather than this kind of thing. And I think there's probably something to that there is really something missing in the experience when these kinds of questions abound, whether they're just or not.
Yeah, I definitely agree that that sentiment seems to be common. I've heard it often.
Yeah. It's hard to know really what is going through somebody's mind and what their experience is like. So one of the other things that I saw in that talk that was highly critical of you, right, was a mention too of some studies that indicated that in reviewing CVs of applicants, that some studies were done showing that that identical CVs with different names on them, that female names were rated lower and offered lower salaries and a lot of things like that, right? I think that's a pretty strong evidence that there is a strong racial bias or a strong gender bias, right? That works to the detriment of women, right?
I think this is another example where they're really choosing whatever evidence fits their ideology, because there's actually even stronger evidence with larger sample size that, at least in some situations like STEM professorships, women are preferred over men 2-to-1. So they've done the same thing, but switched the names. And when it was a female name, it was favored twice as much. And so it's really a bias within the social science literature, where this huge study that shows a large effect is not cited at all, really. But these other studies that aren't really replicated and have smaller sample sizes but show the right narrative, those get replicated much more often.
Interesting. I don't know the truth of that. I really, and I can't evaluate that in the moment, but so I mean, so scientific research, right? When you look at all of these papers, right? I pretty much have, I kind of feel like it's almost hopeless to try to draw conclusions from all of these differing things out there. Am I alone in that? Do you kind of have any kind of?
Yeah, it helps sort of to look at review papers, but those too can sometimes be only saying a certain narrative. But yeah, trying to read as many review papers and just meta-analyses can give you the biggest high-level picture. But it's definitely difficult to read too much into the literature.
Yeah, and I think that's where the importance of that humility comes in, right? We should always be, this is my understanding of the situation, and it's subject to change, and there are things that I don't know about it.
Right.
Yeah,
but
as well as unconscious biases.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like a lot of these programs don't really give that humility. They say, yes, we know this, and this is uncontroversial, and yes, diversity is good, it's unquestionable, and women are oppressed and in all these different ways. And I think that there needs to be some balance in the discussion.
One of the guests on my developer podcast said that she had not experienced really any negative impact of being a woman in tech over the course of her career, but emphasized greatly that she'd heard a lot of stories of women who had, right? And that their experience, it is their experience, right? And I think it is easy to attribute something negative to sexism when it may or may not be, but that doesn't minimize the fact that there are people who have had negative experiences, and having some empathy, should I say that, right? Having some understanding for the fact that people have been through a lot goes a long way. And I think you yourself have been through a lot too. And I think, I think you can understand that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned having some female team members who had some positive reactions to you. Do you have women in your life who are giving you some perspective on some of these things?
Yeah, I've talked to many women about this, and some that disagree, some that agree, and it actually just really depends on their political orientation often, where if you're more progressive, you're less willing to accept some of my ideas, but the libertarian and conservative women see them sort of just as natural ideas.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ideology probably matters more than gender as far as whether somebody's going to be open to what you have to say. So yeah. So I think, what was it? I had something I was going to ask you about. So your experience, right? I mean, you didn't ask for this, and you were thrust into the limelight all of a sudden over a document that I think you knew had to be controversial. You knew potentially. Well, let me ask you that. Did you know that it could lead to your firing?
No, I definitely didn't think that would lead to my firing. There's people that say much more controversial things and with much less evidence, and we definitely have a culture where you write a document and you get feedback on it, and it's a very bottom-up culture where anyone's feedback is accepted to try to improve the culture.
Allegedly, right? Sounds like you've learned otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I've come to the conclusion that, to me, is that you do have good intentions, right? That this was not done to deliberately harm anyone, and I think whether it has caused harm is a matter of interpretation. And I think you could come to the conclusion that you've done something really negative, but I think, to me, it's an act of bravery, right? I mean, it takes a lot of guts to step out there and voice an opinion that is unpopular. And so I think you're to be commended for that, certainly.
Yeah.
So I see some difference in you too, right? I mean, I saw those first couple interviews that you did with Stefan Molyneux and with Jordan Peterson. And I think you're a different guy, right? Something that I've said frequently on my Developer on Fire podcast is that comfort is the enemy of growth, and that punching fear in the face is the way to get out there. And I think you've had to face some things, and I think it has clearly changed you. Has it?
Yeah, I think I've definitely grown And this is part of why I'm doing so many interviews, because I feel like each time I learn something new.
Yeah, I think there's a confidence about you that was not necessarily on display. I mean, I think about the first podcasts that I did for my developer show, and it's embarrassing to listen to those things, right? So I think it's very natural, and man, you've grown a lot in a short amount of time.
I like to think so. I rewatched a lot of them, and I try to be very self-analyzing,
Yeah.
to understand the world.
So I want to I want to basically ask you about you are aware that you have unconscious biases, and you know that there are some possibilities that you have been wrong about some things. Have you, in this time of reflecting and facing a bunch of things, have you modified your opinions on some stuff?
I'm definitely modified some opinions, although I mean I have to say that I had already read so much into the literature, and I wrote this document a month before it went viral, and within that time period, I did have many discussions with people, and so I modified it a lot before then.
Mm.
And so I had already gone through some growth experiences where uh, my opinion was moderated in some ways.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so getting some feedback that was probably more instructive in formulating your opinions than in the internet sensation.
Yeah, I mean, it's the feedback that I got before all this was much more moderate and more rational, and since then it's been much more just emotional outrage.
Yeah. So that experience that I had with going and seeing this document, right, and expecting the worst already, right, as I will fully acknowledge, the first thing that I see in the document as I start reading it is this is a modified form of this document that doesn't have any of the citations that were in the original. And I mean, immediately, right? Why, right? Well, why was that stuff removed? And I think there are several possible explanations for that. Do you have any insight into as to why that was?
Yeah, so there's multiple possible explanations. And one is they had a certain narrative that they wanted to push. Another is they didn't want people clicking off their site. Another
Which I think is
is,
the most likely, probably.
yeah, or just someone had copy and pasted it, which would have naturally removed the citations.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Like,
text. Yeah.
yeah, especially, a fireable offense at Google. Did leak it was likely very careful.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I kind of had a little bit of a
Uh,
lag and lost some of that.
so yeah, you can be fired for leaking things, and people, they are very serious about that. I don't know how much they've tried to look into who was leaking things during this crisis, but people have been fired in the past for leaking.
And do you have? I imagine you're curious about who did that. Do you have any strong desire to try to find out who it was?
I don't have a strong desire to find the exact person, because I think maybe multiple people were able to do it, and in as different situation, or just as time passed, maybe they would have.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're not seeking retribution, right, or any kind of vengeance for this act. I've heard it, and I don't know the true nature of it, and I don't know how much you can really comment, but I've heard that a lawsuit toward Google may be coming, and I wonder, is it, and what are your motivations?
Yes, one is underway. So I think the main motivation is to be able to show people that voicing an opinion is not something to be afraid of, and that employees should be empowered to really point out cases where they think that their employer is doing illegal practices. And I think a lot of this too will empower the companies to make better decisions. So right now, all the pressure is from one side, and which just pushes them farther and farther to some extreme where they have to appease diversity. Really, I mean, there's sort of a diversity mafia that blackmails companies until they have these diversity programs. Otherwise, they'll sue them or just do a ton of bad press on them. And so I think that there needs to be some pressure on the other side to say, no, some of these practices are illegal, and there needs to be some balance, and you need to be able to openly discuss these things.
So yeah, so it sounds like the intent is for a broader good. I imagine that there may be some element too of maybe wanting some vengeance or something like that. And I imagine critics would probably say that that is it, or maybe trying to cash in. What would you say to somebody who says that?
I don't think the NLRB really is a viable thing to cash out on. It's really the federal government investigates Google on my behalf. And it's not some punitive damage type thing.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's probably about all the things that I really wanted to ask you about this. So I think we can probably go ahead and wrap up. Any parting words that you'd like to share with the folks?
I think if they haven't read the document and they've only read headlines, they probably should read the document, because it's definitely not what many of the headlines are saying.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your story, for being candid, and for addressing, all of the things that I wanted to know about this. I do appreciate it. And, like I said, I think you are a well-intentioned, good person. And in some ways, I think that there's probably some valid criticisms, but at the same time, I think, you're also a victim of a witch hunt too.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right.